Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan Your Part Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are looking at Hebrews chapter 7. The whole chapter is focused almost exclusively on Melchizedek, and we have quite a few questions about who the guy is and why this matters and what it has to do with anything. Also, we're back.
I was going to say, are you going to totally dismiss that or what?
We're going to try really hard to stay at it. I just feel bad. We've made so many assertions that we're really back this time, and then we weren't, and then we weren't, and then we weren't. So
let's be real. I'm going to just be honest for our, real life sake here. Just having a baby, it's rough, especially when you got 4 other ones running around. So it's been a thing. Holidays have been also a thing with just, family stuff and raising 5 kids and all kinds of changes, honestly. So yes, we apologize again, but just in all realness and all humanity, it's been a crazy ride the last couple months. So
yes, and we think we can stick to it. I feel like you've probably lost so much trust in us already, but
yeah.
but we're trying to figure out how this will work, and we're committed to trying to figure it out. We are quite behind, but we decided to finish out the New Testament.
We are happy to be starting back again in Hebrews. It kind of feels like we need to just give it justice to finish this out. And then we'll see where we're headed after that. So great to be back, right back here in Hebrews again. We're in chapter 7. And for myself today, Ryan has got a lot more of this figured out. He's probably done a whole lot more studying than I have on this. Shame on me, because I studied the book of Hebrews in college. Took a whole class on it and everything. But I have a lot of questions and still just some confusion about Melchizedek. Melchizedek is this name, this ghost person to me that's just pretty heavily used and talked about in this chapter. So I think there's a lot of connections that make a lot of sense to Ryan, but for me, I'm a little puzzled.
Well, and he was talked about previously in the book of Hebrews
Yes.
as well. So he's a prominent character in this book. Just remember to set the scene here, and this is just a reminder. Really, the whole theme of Hebrews is that Jesus is better than all the things that have come before, because the author is trying to convince Jewish Christians to persevere in the faith, to not walk away from the faith, to not be led into
Or drawn back
by Judaizers, as they're known in the New Testament. The idea is just making a very strong case from Jewish tradition and Jewish history that Jesus is in fact the fulfillment of God's promises, and Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And so chapter 7 is going to be heavily focused on Melchizedek. As always, make sure you read the chapter for yourself. And he's kind of this mystical figure from the Old Testament. If you want to read the story of Melchizedek, there's not many biblical references. He shows up in Genesis 14. He also is mentioned in Psalm 110. Both of those references are going to be referenced here in Hebrews 7. Kind of the story that sets the scene is that Abraham is on his way from a battle, and he bumps into Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is known as a priest king from Salem. And it gets everyone's attention that Abraham gives a tithe to Melchizedek. That is, Abraham would have placed himself under the authority of Melchizedek and recognized him as more senior than himself, which would really get the attention of Jewish people, because to Jewish people, Abraham is the ultimate figure. So why is Abraham tithing to Melchizedek? So from the very beginning of Genesis, Melchizedek is this mystery figure.
Yeah, and even some of the first verses. So essentially this is broken into 2 parts. It's talking about a little bit of background of who he is, I suppose, in the first section. The second is more or less just how Jesus compares to him. But even in this first section, verse 3, he is without father or mother's genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever.
Right.
Who is this guy?
Well, there's lots of theories. Probably my favorite theory that I'm not going to plant a flag in the ground and say that this is true. I just like it. One of the theories is that this is a theophany or a Christophany. That is a Old Testament appearance of Christ. And Melchizedek is actually Christ himself showing up to Abraham, and Abraham is able to supernaturally recognize the authority of Melchizedek, that is Jesus. and worship him and offer tithes to him. I guess I probably shouldn't say explicitly worship him, but the reason that people push back on that is because the author of Hebrews does make a point to say that he resembles the Son of God. He does not say that he is the Son of God.
Right.
And I think that's a pretty sharp pushback on that theory, but I still like it. No matter what, he's kind of a mystical figure. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have a mother or father. It just means that the Bible doesn't mention his mother or father. He kind of shows up out of nowhere and disappears back into nowhere. Then also in Psalm 110, verse 4, we see that there is a new priest coming after the order of Melchizedek.
Well, it says too, because those details are not a part of the scriptures, it says that is how he continues a priest forever, because it's not written down like when his life began or ended. But he is also supposed to be, our study Bible mentions that he's supposed to be like this foreshadowing person of who Christ will
there
be.
Is no question that he is a foreshadowing of Christ. In my mind, no question at all. He may not be a physical appearance of Christ, but I think he's definitely a foreshadowing. And one of the significant pieces that I think you were kind of stumbling on or like a little bit confused by or frustrated by, is that Melchizedek is represented as both priest and king. And these are two significant offices in the Old Testament. They would have been significant offices that the audience of Hebrews would have understood. The king is the ruler of the people. And so the king rules the people on God's behalf in the best circumstances. Now, the Old Testament is full of situations where that did not play out well. A priest represents the people to God. So it's almost like they point opposite directions, if that makes sense. Like God gives his authority to the king, and the king rules the people. So it's like God down toward the people. The priest represents the people to God. So it's like the people up to God. Does that make sense? Is that helpful, or is that more confusing?
No, it does.
So these two roles are important, and the fact that Melchizedek holds both of those roles is incredibly significant, because not only is he able to represent God, he's also able to represent the people. And Psalm 110 was talking about the fact that there would be eventually the arrival of a priest king who can do both. And we know, not only from Hebrews, from the New Testament, and from our own faith, that Jesus is that priest king. He understands us, and he can fully represent us. That has been played out in Hebrews in several different passages. But he also represents the rule of God over us. And there will come a time where Jesus does rule and reign together with us. So like whether you feel like that's in the near future or not, like that will occur. So Jesus is both priest and king. He is in the order of Melchizedek. The other thing with the order of Melchizedek that can that I think is important to highlight here is that the author is going to talk about the Levitical priesthood and the priesthood of Melchizedek. That kind of tripped you up a little bit as well, I think.
Yeah, it did. I think I'm kind of understanding a little bit more too, though, because of verse 7. It's beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior, because if you look at the verse before that, this man who does not have his descent from them received the tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So Abraham had the promise. Mm-hmm. Melchizedek is giving a blessing. So he is the superior.
Yeah, correct. Yes.
Blessing the inferior.
Yes.
So like they're not even from the same line or anything,
right,
which is helpful to understand too, because from that, even from that scenario, then Abraham and those people have the Levitical priesthood. So they like have their own thing going. But it's saying that beyond that, Christ will come and be even more superior to that.
And that's where Psalm 110 becomes important. So the Old Testament law would be...
Verse 4.
Would be that the priests are from the Levites. So every time there's a new high priest that comes from the line of the Levites, this is actually referenced in Hebrews as well, the people live under that high priest until the death of that high priest. And when that high priest dies, that's the end of his reign. Mm-hmm. They shift whoever the high priest is, and now there's a new reign of a new high priest. Actually, fun fact, the Romans wouldn't allow a high priest to rule till death. They purposely kept switching the high priest so no one man could have influence over the Jewish people. So it was a way to actually keep them from uniting around a high priest. So they just like purposely kept changing that figure, which is why when you read the Gospels, Jesus is in front of or dealing with different high priests at different times. Anyway, the point that the author here is making is that certainly this is not a permanent priesthood because these guys die. And there's provision made for the fact that you have to raise up a new one and follow a new one until that one dies. So this is not a permanent priesthood, but we are looking forward to a time where there will be a permanent priesthood. Well, how can we have a permanent priesthood? We would have to be under a high priest that does not die. And Jesus is, we believe, that high priest who does not die. He knows us, he represents us, he cares for us, and he lives on forever because he's conquered death. He is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, fulfilling Psalm 110, verse 4.
So I really attached myself to this one verse as Ryan was reading through the passage today, kind of going off of that whole, like, these priests die, they don't continue on. If you start, I guess, in 23, chapter 7, verse 23. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Because Jesus has conquered death, he continues to make this sacrifice. He continues to intercede for us because he is always living. There is no end. So I think that's kind of cool. Kind of like that, one of those like goosebump feelings, like, oh, that's so amazing. Like what they tried to do was not possible because their priest could not eternally intercede for them.
Correct.
Like Jesus can.
Like Jesus can. And you can actually highlight there, this makes Jesus, this is verse 22, this makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. That word better, it's going to show up over and over and over again in Hebrews because, again, the author is making the case that this is a better covenant. It's a new covenant. It's the one that God has intended for us for all time, and we should persevere in that faith. So one of the things that sticks out to me that is a great you apart from this, I know that combination of priest and king can get kind of heady, and it just feels like a little bit academic, but if we like distill it into real world, 100%, we are under the authority of God. We do have to do what he says, and we do have to obey his commandments. 100%, we need to do that. We have to honor God with our lives. But sometimes we can weigh that too heavily where it feels like God's just like wagging his finger at us all the time. At the same time, we have a God who's also our high priest. That is, he understands us and he represents us and he intercedes for us. So those two things are both true. Like he is priest and he is king, and they're not opposed to each other. So it's like, yes, we have to follow what God says, but also we can know and be guaranteed that God loves us and wants the best for us and cares for us and identifies with us. So I think the combination of those two things is incredible and it's encouraging. It's just like a helpful reminder for your day. Depending on which side of the spectrum you fall on, I probably tend to fall on the law-driven side, but I know there's plenty of people that are fall on the compassion-driven side, and what's cool is that two of them are meant to go together because Jesus is the great priest king that we've been promised and we've been looking forward to, and guess what? He's here. So
Still reigns forever.
There you go. That's what we got for today. We'll be back again tomorrow with Hebrews chapter 8. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Before we get to the reading, I want to recommend another podcast that I'm a part of called God's Whole Story. This year, we're releasing one episode a week on Monday mornings, overviewing one book of the Bible each week. So God's Plan Your Part is a deep dive, chapter by chapter, where God's Whole Story is taking it one book at a time. If you enjoy this podcast, you'll enjoy that one. Go check it out. Now, here's the reading. Hebrews chapter 7. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though they also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest, not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, "You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made priest with an oath, by the one who said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number, because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently, because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save the uttermost, those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once and for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.